Thank you all for coming. I'm really honored you spend your evening listening to me. I'm not sure why it calls into question your judgment, but you're nice to do it. I'm going to talk for just a little bit about a range of stuff. I'm going to guess a little about what you might be interested in. And I often like to cater what I say to the audience I'm speaking to, and so I'm going to talk about a part of the book that I've never been asked about in any of the interviews I've done or talked about in any of my talks that I hope will be of interest to you, since it involves someone you all know. And then I'm happy to answer questions about anything you want about journalism or anything else, or careers, or whatever you'd like. This book came out on January 11th, so it's been out for a couple months, and I've had a lot of fun with my co-author, John Halperin, who writes for New York Magazine, getting to travel around and talk to a lot of different audiences. We generally like, when we talk to a group, to get to know at least a little bit about them. So I'm going to take a quick survey. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand and vote. If you're uncomfortable voting in front of other people, close your eyes when you raise your hand. Who here has read the book or read about the book? All right, that's good. So I can say whatever I want about it. Only a few of you will know whether I'm telling the truth or not. That's good. We've gotten to travel quite a bit in the last few weeks for the book. Went to Austin, Texas, and Boston, and New Hampshire, and over this last weekend, Los Angeles and San Francisco. And part of what I like about it, my career as a reporter, is I do get to travel a lot. I started covering politics. I worked for ABC News in Washington, D.C., and then in 1994, I told them I wanted to move up to New York and live on the Upper West Side so I could be more in touch with the real lives of real people as I covered politics around America. And I get to still do that, to travel lots of different places, including to promote the book. And we've been really heartened by the reaction people have had to it. This is not a book, even though it's about politicians and about a presidential campaign, that we conceived of to be about politics or about campaign, really. It's really more about people. It's about the presidential candidates and their spouses and how they dealt with the incredible pressure and incredible spotlight that they were under in this campaign. It's a challenge to write a book about politics these days because there's so much coverage of elections. Anyone interested, the premise for a lot of people in publishing was, if you're interested in the campaign, you watched cable TV, you read the newspaper, you read magazines, you went on the internet, and you read everything you could possibly want to know about the campaign. And what John Halperin and I did was, in the middle of the campaign, right after John McCain won the Republican nomination, and while Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were still fighting it out for the Democrats, we came up with an idea that said, what if we focus not on the strategy and the tactics and the daily back and forth, but rather on the candidates and their spouses, and looked at the question of how they related to each other, and then how the candidates related to each other. So what was the relationship like between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, between John McCain and Hillary Clinton, to kind of the backstory of how they got to the starting line to be presidential candidates. And we found that having that focus allowed us to overcome a lot of the long odds of how to write a book about a campaign that was so well covered, and so deeply covered and constantly covered. One of the things that we did in order to try to get around that was a lot of reporting. Most reporters these days, because of the pressures of the internet and the 24/7 news cycle, don't get to do the kind of reporting that reporters could do a long time ago, where you wrote one story a day or one story a week. We did over 300 interviews for the book with over 200 people, and these were long interviews. They weren't short. Some of them were 6-7 hours long. And we talked to people who, in many cases, we'd known for a long time. John and I have both been covering politics for 20 years, so a lot of the people we talked to trusted us from the beginning, and after we explained to them what the project was, they trusted us even more. And they invested in having us come out at the end with something that they would feel told the story of, what we call in the subtitle of the book, The Race of a Lifetime. We wanted them to feel like the true story was told. We've both known not just the staffers, but the candidates in most cases for a pretty long time. John was at the Kennedy School at Harvard when Barack Obama was at the law school, and their relationship consisted primarily of Barack Obama bumming over 1,000 cigarettes from John during the time they were there. John usually, to be provocative, says that he was Barack Obama's dealer, but it was just for cigarettes, nothing else. And he knew him for a long time, and they were not friends, but certainly friendly. And I knew the Clintons for a long time. I covered them in Arkansas back when Bill Clinton was first running for president in 1991. Let me do another survey question and ask people here Who's more interested in journalism as opposed to politics? Who's more interested in politics as opposed to journalism? All right, so a little bit of both. I'm going to talk about the journalism of how we did this book, so maybe combine the two things. This was not an easy book to write, as I said, because there was this premise that there was so much coverage. One way we got around it was to do a lot of interviews. I mentioned that. Another way we got around it was to relentlessly focus on the candidates and the spouses, to not get drawn into the daily back and forth. And another thing we did was to try to focus on the emotion of the campaign. So much of what happened in this campaign related to the Clintons, John Edwards, the Obamas, John McCain, and then Sarah and Todd Palin was pretty emotional. And to get the behind-the-scenes stories of what happened with them was not easy to do, but we were able to do it in a lot of cases. Let me now talk to you about one character in the book. This is the one who I don't normally talk about because I've not been asked about him, but he might be of interest to you all, which is Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman played a really interesting role in this campaign, and he's a pretty big character in our book. And so let me just tell you the story of Joe Lieberman in the 2008 campaign as we reported it. He was someone who, as you know, was Al Gore's running mate in 2000 and almost was vice president of the United States. They won the popular vote but didn't take office. And Joe Lieberman was very focused from the time after that election on doing what he thought was right for what he believed in and for the people of his state. And that led him to have a big falling out with the Democratic Party. He almost lost his Senate seat, as some of you probably know. And he was unable to stay true, he felt, to the Democratic Party. So he became an independent. And in 2006 and 2007, as Democrats were gearing up to run for office, not one of them asked Joe Lieberman for his endorsement. He was so unpopular within the Democratic Party that they didn't want his support. Even Chris Dodd, his fellow senator from Connecticut, didn't seek his endorsement. And from talking to people who are familiar with Joe Lieberman and how he felt about this, he was kind of upset by it. He felt like he was kind of ostracized within the Democratic Party in a way that was uncomfortable for him. But particularly on the issue of the Iraq War, where he was so visible in support of President Bush, he felt he was doing the right thing, and that if that meant he was ostracized, so be it. He was very good friends with John McCain. He had been for years, and John McCain felt like Joe Lieberman's support for the Iraq War was an incredibly brave and principled thing to do, given the difficulty it caused him within the Democratic Party. And when John McCain's campaign was in big trouble in 2007, at the end of the year, his campaign had totally collapsed. He was starting to come back, and he was staking a lot on New Hampshire, where Joe Lieberman had a following. He asked Joe Lieberman for his endorsement and said it would really mean a lot to him. Joe Lieberman, like John McCain a lot, was very sympathetic to him on a lot of issues, even though on a lot of social issues they don't agree. But he knew that endorsing a Republican, having been the Democratic nominee just 8 years ago, was potentially a big problem. And so he thought about it and decided, after thinking about it and consulting, that he would do it. He asked one friend whether he should endorse McCain, and McCain's campaign at that point, while coming back, still looked like it was trouble. And the friend said it was a horrible idea, but McCain would be out of the race in the next couple of weeks anyway, so it didn't really matter, and he could go ahead and do it. He did endorse him in New Hampshire. McCain was incredibly grateful, and he came back and he won the Republican nomination. And when he was then looking for a running mate, he wanted to pick Joe Lieberman. And that was a pretty controversial thing to do because, as I said, and as you know, Joe Lieberman had been the running mate for the other party just 8 years before. But it was important for John McCain to pick a running mate who would get people to think anew about him, to look at him in a different way. And his idea was to basically have a national unity ticket, a Democrat and a Republican, two guys who agreed on a lot of issues related to foreign policy but disagreed on domestic issues. That they would take a term limit pledge, that they would just serve one term in the White House, so Republicans wouldn't see Lieberman as someone who could leverage his being on the ticket to get elected president himself. And this was the plan. And it was the plan for much of the summer as John McCain started to focus on the final selection. He needed a dramatic pick, and no one else on his list that he was considering for his running mate was dramatic. Joe Lieberman thought this was incredibly exciting. He had wanted to be vice president with Al Gore. That didn't work out, and he thought, here's my second chance. But what he also thought was that he could go down in history, given the fact that the Republicans were going to be the underdog, as the first person ever to be the losing vice presidential candidate on two different tickets for two different parties. He thought that might not be the way he wanted his obituary to read, but nonetheless, he was open to it. And again, it's testament to how disenchanted he'd become, how alienated he'd become from the Democratic Party, that he was willing to consider this. And it was testament to how difficult, John McCain found his position that he was willing to consider a Democrat to be on the ticket with him, but he wanted to send a message that he was a different kind of Republican, someone who would stand apart from the record of George Bush. So the process is going forward. Joe Lieberman is really the person McCain is going to pick. McCain's staff is laying the groundwork because they knew there was one big obstacle to picking him, that his positions on issues like abortion and gay rights and other social issues were so out of step with the base of the Republican Party, the kind of activists who go to the convention, that there could be an uprising at the Republican convention and McCain could lose control of the party. Maybe even the delegates to the convention wouldn't nominate Joe Lieberman. They laid a lot of groundwork to see if that would be possible, if they could pick him and get him through the convention. And the Sunday before the Thursday that John McCain intended to name his running mate, McCain's aides told him, you cannot pick Joe Lieberman. Word had leaked out a few days before that McCain was considering someone who was pro-choice on abortion, and the reaction was very negative. And so they told him, if you pick Joe Lieberman, the convention will be a disaster. You'll never get the party back together. And at that point, McCain reluctantly said, all right, he would not pick his friend Joe Lieberman, and he had no options. He hadn't left himself anyone else on the list of people whose backgrounds had been looked into, who would be game-changing picks, who would be dramatic. It was basically with no disrespect meant towards these gentlemen, some pretty boring figures, standard issue male Republicans. And McCain felt in his heart that none of those people would be the kind of picks who could change things and make people think anew. So they did something that I think history will show, and our book shows, does not do John McCain any favors. It doesn't make it look particularly good. Kind of in a panic on a Sunday night, sitting in his condominium in Phoenix with two of his aides, one of them said, or two of them there said, what about Sarah Palin? And McCain quickly latched onto that and thought that was a good idea. This is someone he'd met on only a couple of occasions, someone the campaign had not looked into the background of at all, and someone who, based on her record and resume, was not nearly as experienced as Joe Lieberman. And it's kind of funny to think that you can go from Joe Lieberman, and that option doesn't work, to Sarah Palin. They couldn't, in most ways, be more different. He's from the center of the Democratic Party, an Orthodox Jew from the Northeast. She's from the Republican Party, a born-again Christian from Alaska. And yet, in essence, there was some logic to it, because she was a game-changing pick in her own way. She was someone who, if defined correctly, would be seen as an outside pick, someone who was not from Washington, someone who had gone up against the establishment of the Republican Party in her state. And McCain quickly warmed to the idea. We can talk more about the selection if you'd like, but one of the things that then happened was the announcement came, and people were pretty surprised, including Joe Lieberman. He had no idea that Sarah Palin was being considered, and in fact, when her name was announced, he confused her with the governor of Hawaii. The governor of Hawaii is a woman who's a Republican named Linda Lingle, and she's a little bit more prominent, or at least was more prominent, than Sarah Palin at the time. So, and she also is a Jewish American. And when Lieberman heard the announcement that it was Sarah Palin, he thought it was the Jewish governor of Hawaii. So he thought that McCain had in fact picked a Jewish person to be on the ticket. Well, he was wrong, of course. It wasn't Sarah Palin. I won't say she's the least Jewish person in America, but it's pretty close. She'd make the top 200 for sure. And Lieberman was disappointed, but in fact then quickly became, because he's so loyal to John McCain, a huge supporter of Sarah Palin. He spent time with her at the Republican convention. One of the only meetings she had at the Republican convention with an outside group, because she was so focused on preparing for her big speech, was with the group AIPAC that was meeting in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Joe Lieberman and his wife went with Palin to the event, helped prepare her for it, and met with her at the convention. And then, a few weeks later, met with her again. This was at the low point for Sarah Palin in her preparations and in her time 2 months on the ticket, preparing for her vice presidential debate with Joe Biden in Philadelphia. She was, according to the people around her, having kind of a nervous breakdown. She was staying up all night preparing because she was so nervous about not being prepared. She was eating almost nothing, drinking almost nothing, and she was at times catatonic. They'd ask her a question during the debate preparation, and she would put her head down and not answer. And they literally thought that in the debate, rather than just doing sort of an embarrassingly bad job, that her performance would be catastrophic. and it would end the campaign and any chance they had of winning. So some of the senior aides to McCain on a Sunday came up from Washington, where their campaign was headquartered, to Philadelphia to meet with Palin and to look in on her debate prep. And by coincidence, Joe Lieberman was coming up that day at the request of the campaign to work with Sarah Palin, particularly on foreign policy. And so they walk into the room, and it's a scene that was described to us by many people there. This room with the drapes drawn, very claustrophobic, a hotel conference room, the smell of several hours old French fries and sandwiches in the very stale air. Sarah Palin sitting surrounded by these stacks of index cards that she used to prepare for her speeches and her media interviews in the debate. And she was being very unresponsive. And Joe Lieberman came in and saw the situation and tried to loosen her up and help her out, but it didn't seem to be working. They left the room. Left Sarah Palin alone in there. And at that point, one of McCain's aides, who is not religious at all, but who knew that Governor Palin was and who knew that Senator Lieberman is, said to Senator Lieberman, "Would you go in and pray with her?" And Senator Lieberman, because he was supportive of anything they needed, agreed to go in and pray. And the two of them had a pretty interesting colloquy. There was one other person in the room, an aide to Sarah Palin from Alaska, but the two of them sat there, and Joe Lieberman started talking to her about some teachings from the Orthodox tradition, and also trying to get her to focus on the moment where she was, and said to her, "You've got to be saying, what am I doing here? How did this happen? This is the moment to really make it count for something." And Palin said, as she had said several times before to McCain aides, that given the situation, she felt like the only reason she was there was destiny, that it was God's decision to have her there. And that kind of bucked her up. And Joe Lieberman there, talking to her in a very thoughtful way, in a very spiritual way, got her bucked up. And they shortly thereafter made the decision to leave Philadelphia, go to Arizona. Senator Lieberman didn't go with them. But that moment that he had with her was really a turning point for her. Got her head back in the right place, and she prepared for the debate. And in fact, did just fine the debate, better than she did when she went to do an interview with Katie Couric. And she fared better there than she did when Tina Fey imitated her on Saturday Night Live, for sure. But Joe Lieberman helped her then, and then campaigned with her a few more times during the year, and really was about as supportive a person on McCain's team as anybody out there. And to this day, if you ask either Joe Lieberman or Sarah Palin about the other one, they have very warm feelings about each other. And that's the kind of backstory and set of relationships that we try to trace in the book. That one involving a more minor character in the book, Senator Lieberman, although he pops up quite a bit. Let me talk just briefly about one other bigger relationship in the book, and then take questions about whatever you'd like. The core of our book, the most important relationship in there, is between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. The country and the world saw their relationship through the prism of their contest for the Democratic nomination. Exceedingly fierce competition that went on for, as you know, longer than nomination fights have gone on in the modern era. And that led a lot of people to be surprised. I don't want to give away the whole ending of the book, but Hillary Clinton becomes Secretary of State. And that was a surprise to me. It was a surprise to a lot of people that Barack Obama offered her the job and that Hillary Clinton agreed to take it. And what John Heilman and I found in reporting the book, again, looking at the backstory and the history and the relationships between these people, is that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were pretty close before they were competitors. They were friends. When Barack Obama was running for the Senate in Illinois, Hillary Clinton went out and campaigned for him in Chicago, raised money for him, had him to Washington, into her home there, and raised money for him there. When she came back from one of her trips to Chicago after campaigning alongside of him and doing a fundraiser, she said to her staff, quote, "There's a superstar in Chicago." She thought he was going to be very promising and wanted to help him, and did help him get elected. When he came to the Senate, he was extraordinarily solicitous of her advice, because she understood his unusual situation. Someone who'd come to the Senate as an international celebrity, someone who'd been a best-selling author, and who'd been besieged by requests for his time when there was all this attention over him. When he was sworn into the Senate, Michelle Obama was asked what she thought of it, and she said, maybe someday he'll do something to merit all this attention. The reality was there was a lot of attention, and it was very heady, but it also was ahead of any accomplishments in the Senate. And in the Senate, where seniority matters above all else, probably as much in the Senate as any institution, it's difficult, if you're a celebrity, to not to build up some resentment on the part of your older and more experienced colleagues. Barack Obama didn't want to be resented. He wanted to get along. He wanted to play by the rules. But he had all this fame and notoriety and invitations to appear on magazine covers and in the press and in public events. So Hillary Clinton gave him advice about how to deal with that, about how to balance trying to get things done with the need to sort of play by the rules of the Senate. Barack Obama was extraordinarily grateful. He, amongst other things, when he was on the Senate floor, between votes, he would normally be by himself, wouldn't approach other senators, except if Hillary Clinton was there. He would go over and talk to her. He gave her a framed photo, a picture of himself and Michelle Obama and their two daughters. Hillary Clinton put that in a very prominent place in her Senate office. She kept it there until the day she left to go be in the government. As far as John and I could tell from our reporting, she never threw darts at it or treated it in a disrespectful way, but left it up there. And after their combat was over, after Hillary Clinton left the race and had a period like all presidential candidates who failed do, where she had to adjust to the fact that she had lost, she started to have respect for Barack Obama. She started to see that he was going to be elected over John McCain, something she had doubted for much of the time when they were competitors. And she believed that it was important to at least consider serving in his government if he asked, because she remembered from her time as First Lady, watching her husband, how important it was when he needed something for people to say, yes, Mr. President. So in the end, when she does accept the job, the last scene in the book really is where the two of them have a moment in a phone call after midnight one night, after she's thought about it for a week about whether she'll take the job. Everyone was telling her to take it. Her husband was saying she should take it. Everyone around her. She really didn't want to do it. She was tired. She wanted to go back to a more normal life. Believe it or not, even if you're Hillary Clinton, if you're in the Senate, you can go to a Broadway show, you can go out to dinner, you can go out to go on vacation. No one really follows you around. As Secretary of State, she'd be back in a life much more like what she had when she was First Lady. That did not appeal to her. She wanted to stay in the Senate. But in this phone call, and I won't give away that part of the ending, but both of them show a kind of emotional vulnerability in this call about different things. She shows emotional vulnerability about the role her husband might play as a disruptive force, as he had during her campaign. Barack Obama shows some vulnerability about just how badly he felt he needed Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. She tells him no, and he asks her to think about it overnight. And the next morning, she changes her mind. We call, in the beginning of the book, we call their relationship, somewhat fancifully, but not totally, a love story, because it's a classic boy meets girl, boy fights with girl for the Democratic nomination, boy gets girl back kind of story. But it is, again, the most important relationship in the book in many ways, and the heart of what we tried to do. A lot of people who've read the book, not everyone, but those who saw what John and I tried to execute, I think you see a fuller portrait of what these people are like behind the scenes. The way they talk, sometimes profane, but often and usually in a way that is much more, allows you to be much more empathetic towards anyone who puts themselves forward to run for an office like that, or if you're married to someone who does that. Again, the kind of pressures that are involved there. The first question was, what did John McCain hope to get by picking Joe Lieberman, who wasn't particularly popular in the Democratic Party, and quite the contrary, and in fact was, as a liberal Democrat, unpopular in the Republican Party, right? And the second question was, did we have this idea simply about this campaign or more generally and perhaps in the future, right? Do I get to pick which one I answer, or I have to answer them both? I'll answer them both. It's good analysis on your part, because if the idea is to, with the pick of your running mate, is to expand your popularity and your reach, picking a guy who's unpopular in both parties seems a little counterintuitive. Some of the reasons he thought about picking him I mentioned before, which is this notion of a national unity ticket. The reason why Joe Lieberman, I think, the heart of why, though, he would have been a potentially strong pick, the most important thing for anyone who's a presidential nominee of a major party in picking a running mate, far and away, is to pick someone who is perceived by the public and the press instantly as ready to be president from day one. If you don't clear that bar, the other factors of politics or compatibility, they don't really matter. And Joe Lieberman, whatever else one thinks about him, would have been seen by people as ready to step in and be president, to be commander-in-chief, have the experience, the knowledge of national security. So that was one rationale. And particularly against Barack Obama. The argument, the effective argument, a few times during the campaign when John McCain made an effective argument against Obama, it was, he's not ready to be president, he's young and callow, I'm a guy who's been around, I'm older, I'm experienced. Joe Lieberman would have matched that. It would have reinforced that message and said, you can have two guys in the White House who know what they're doing, or at least they claim to know what they're doing, or a guy who's young and doesn't know what he's doing. And then finally, it's one of the things that McCain was selling, so much so that he almost took a one-term pledge when he was trying to win the Republican nomination. This notion of an older guy who would come in for one term and solve the big problems that the country faced in a bipartisan or nonpartisan way. Iraq, Afghanistan, entitlements, the deficit, campaign finance issues, reform issues across the board, and that the way to reinforce that message was to say, here I am with another guy who's been around, who's ready to retire, even though he's not as old as Senator Lieberman's not as old as Senator McCain, and who's going to put aside party to solve these problems and then take this one-term pledge. So that was the logic. I think what your question suggests is right, which they may have been underestimating the degree to which they would have alienated people on the left and the right so firmly that they wouldn't have been able to draw in support based on some of those thematics. But that was the idea behind it. In terms of the second question, it's been a while since there's been a commercially successful campaign book. John and I thought about this idea kind of spontaneously, organically, as we were driving back from a McCain event that was horrible for McCain, but fantastically rich for journalists. And this campaign had great characters and great plot. And whether you're doing fiction or nonfiction, if you want a great story, those are your two essential elements. The twists and turns and the almost daily changing of the dynamics of the race and who was up and who was down, and then these extraordinarily rich characters. John and I always joke that if you've got a presidential campaign where Rudy Giuliani is the seventh most interesting candidate, you know you've got an interesting race to cover. So I think it is the case that this kind of focus on the personal, the high human drama of a presidential campaign by looking at the candidates and their spouses is something one could do in other elections. It was particularly ripe to be done this time because the candidates were so interested. One thing we don't talk about is who we interviewed for the book to protect our sources. We also made it a practice not to be specific about who we've gotten feedback from. I can tell you we have gotten feedback from all quarters, Democrats and Republicans, and senior levels of the process, and it's all been positive. Now, there may be people out there who are furious at us, but they've not chosen to get in touch. Almost no one has contacted us to say the book's wrong in any way. Publicly, there have only been 3 small things that have been disputed about what was in the book, and with all due respect to people disputing them, they're not accurate. We knew if the book was successful at all, that people might question how we reported it, whether it was accurate, and as I said before, we always told people what we were doing, what the project was. More precise, we did over 300 interviews with 200 people. Those of you who aren't math majors like me, you can still figure out that meant we interviewed some people multiple times. Start every interview with 2 martinis. Getting people to talk wasn't as big a challenge as you might think. We, as I said before, we knew almost everybody we interviewed for the book. And we had long-standing relationships of trust with them. We started every interview, even when we were re-interviewing someone, with a long explanation of the rules of the interview, how we were going to use the material, and with a pledge of confidentiality. It'd be great if we could write a book like this doing on-the-record interviews, but people won't talk on that basis for a project like this. So we used a method that's been used in a lot of other books of narrative nonfiction about history, about business and sports and politics, by promising that we wouldn't reveal that they had talked to us, both in our reporting and in our writing. Once people were comfortable with us, once they felt like the project was something that would be a serious work of journalism and history, we didn't have very much trouble. Almost everybody, fewer than a dozen people who we wanted to interview declined, and fewer than a dozen of the interviews were the least bit contentious. There was one person who neither John nor I knew before the project, and we definitely wanted to get them for the book because they were an important player in one of the campaigns, and the person never got back to us. We'd email, we'd call, they never got back to us. And then after a while, we'd sort of given up ever getting them to talk. We signed a deal with HBO to make a movie of the book even before the book was finished. And on the day that appeared in the newspaper, that morning at 7 a.m., the person called my co-author, John Halperin, and said, HBO, a movie, when can we do an interview? So getting that person to talk was a little bit of a bank shot. No one else came forward just because of the HBO movie, but in the main, it didn't require that. It just required drawing on the relationships we had and telling them what we were doing. Why did Barack Obama pick Joe Biden? Well, we write a lot about that in the book. As much as he did want her eventually for Secretary of State, as we quoted in the book, telling people at a party he came to in New York during the time he was looking for a running mate, he said, I think jokingly, but not completely, you can't have 3 presidents in the White House. Having both Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton there, I think he thought was just a little too much. And in addition, a lot of the things that he had talked about in the campaign, Bill Clinton's financial dealings, Bill Clinton's record as president in some ways, his fundraising for his presidential library and his foundation, I think President Obama thought, and people around him thought, that was a bridge too far in terms of looking at the background to put her on the ticket. There was also a recognition, though, among some of his advisors, that not putting her on the ticket was potentially problematic, and that they had to find ways to minimize that problem. So, for instance, one of the people he was inclined to consider, Kathleen Sebelius, didn't get to the final round, in part because he was told, if you pick a woman that's not Hillary Clinton, it'll beg the question even more. It's interesting. I talked when I was before the Q&A about the relationships in the book and some of the backstory. The relationship between Barack Obama and Joe Biden was something we didn't know much about before the campaign. In the Senate, when Obama got there, he would regularly tell his aides that there was no other, of the 99 other senators, there was no one as condescending to him as Joe Biden. He would, at one hearing, Joe Biden was talking on and on, as he was known to do, and Barack Obama wrote on a note to Robert Gibbs during the hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee that Biden chaired and passed it to Robert Gibbs, and the note said, "Shoot me now." He thought he was condescending, he thought he talked too much, and on the day that Biden announced his own presidential campaign, somewhat poignantly, he ran in 1988 when he was considered a strong candidate and had some problems with accusations of plagiarism. Running 20 years later, on the day he announced that campaign, an article appeared, an interview appeared that he'd done with the New York Observer, in which he referred to Barack Obama as clean and articulate, and it caused something of a controversy. He had to apologize to Obama. Biden had a view of Obama that was very similar to Hillary Clinton's view and John McCain's view, that this guy was too inexperienced, too much of a line cutter, that he was all rhetoric and not a serious person. But he grew to respect Barack Obama during the campaign, particularly after he gave his speech about race in Philadelphia in the wake of his problems with his pastor, Jeremiah Wright. And Obama grew to really respect Biden. Biden did very well in the debates when he was a candidate. So Joe Biden was in play, and his resume fit with a lot of what Barack Obama was looking for. As we report in the book, he settled on Joe Biden almost immediately as the person he was probably going to pick. But Barack Obama is a guy who's much more about his head than his gut on major decisions. So while his gut said he'd probably pick Biden, he then had a very vigorous and rigorous process, much more rigorous than John McCain used to pick his running mate, where he looked at other possibilities, looked at Biden's background in detail. And even as the process went forward, and even as his suspicion, his instinct that he would pick Biden was turning out to be true, he would regularly say to his aides aloud, "I can't believe I'm going to pick Joe Biden as my running mate, this guy who had been so condescending to him." And in the end, what pushed it over the top, the other two finalists were Evan Bayh and Tim Kaine, the governor of Virginia, was when the Russians went into Georgia and invaded shortly before Obama was going to pick. And Biden's record on national security was so much stronger than Tim Kaine's and even his fellow senator, Evan Bayh, that it was a pretty easy pick at that point. And as we write in the book, although Palin got a lot of the attention during the time they were both on the ticket, the tensions between Obama and Biden were actually pretty high, much higher, at least as we reported it, than between McCain and Palin. And they had some pretty rough moments, particularly when Joe Biden allowed his famous mouth to work its way on the ticket, saying some things that made Barack Obama, we report, more angry at Biden than he ever was at Hillary Clinton when they were running against each other. But they patched that up and have had, at least up until recently, a pretty good relationship in the White House. The press role is really big. It's more diffuse now, the way press is and media is about everything, so that it's not just the major networks and the big newspapers and magazines anymore. If you're interested in the campaign, you can obviously read about it in a lot of places. But the so-called old media still has an extraordinary role. It still has a much bigger reach than websites and cable TV. And that is the way most Americans learn about the candidates. Most Americans aren't on the web reading position papers. They aren't at rallies unless they live in a state like Iowa and New Hampshire. And so the reason why people who do what I do still get our calls returned is because they do recognize in the campaigns the reality that we transmit a lot of information that has voters making up their mind about who's viable and whether people are considered likable or not. In most elections, the Senate, governor, other down-ballot races, paid advertising is really important because there isn't much news coverage. In the presidential, there's so much news coverage. The quantity of it and its impact on voters is bigger. As much as the campaign spent hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising, it's dwarfed in its impact. I think most everybody agrees by the news coverage. So it's a very huge role, and it's one that's become increasingly controversial as the media has declined as a business, as it's declined in its influence. The one thing we've succeeded in is uniting the left and the right against us. They both think we do a really bad job. And so the influence is a little different than it was. In some ways now, as I said before with Sarah Palin, the fact that the press seems to cover her in a tough way has helped her and made her, if not more viable, at least more attractive to a lot of conservatives. Barack Obama, I think anyone who's telling you the truth would tell you that part of why he was able to succeed as a candidate against the odds of beating Hillary Clinton and then beating John McCain was the press liked Barack Obama a lot and gave him more favorable coverage. So it's an extraordinarily large responsibility and one that we don't always do perfectly. But the candidates and the campaigns agree with my analysis, and that's why they spend so much time trying to manipulate our coverage and to put the candidates in the best light in the relatively uncontrolled environment that they have to engage in dealing with the press. The future of women in politics in America is brighter every 2 years and every 4 years, but we still have an extraordinarily long way to go until there's anything like parity. Part of the problem now is a problem we've had for years, which is politics is even in a country as open as ours, is still something where connections and the ability to raise money and the ability to build up a long resume matter a lot. We had Bush, Clinton, Bush, and then almost another Clinton. It was kind of extraordinary to have that much hereditary and family power in a country that's supposed to be democratic and not have that kind of system. I think that Hillary Clinton was a bit of an aberration because she was from a big state. She did have all the fundraising contacts. She did have a long resume in public life. If you say now, if your goal is you don't care if it's a Democrat or Republican, but you want to see a woman elected president, it's hard to find anybody on the horizon in 4 years, 8 years, even 12 years, who you can kind of project forward and say they'd be in a strong position to do all the things you need to do to be an elected president. Down ballot in other positions, it's more encouraging. Although if you look at the numbers in the Senate and the House, governors, state legislators, it's still nowhere near parity, obviously. And the percentage increase has stalled from a few years ago when there was a pretty big jump up. So, there are other ways to contribute to society and to affect change besides being in elective office and even appointed office. But it's still, the most powerful force for that. And politics is a bit ahead of business. You look at the Fortune 500 company CEOs. The Academy has done better, but it's still a huge imbalance. So I try to be an optimistic person and emphasize the positive, but there's still a long way to go. And again, a lot of the success, particularly in politics and business, Fortune 500 businesses, does involve passage of time. It's important that women get in and be positioned to keep moving up, making up new rules for success, but also, fortunately or unfortunately, playing by the existing rules to compete, because men still make up a lot of the rules. I think in the short term, I don't see anyone in the Republican Party who's with the exception of Sarah Palin, who I don't think will run, and if she does, I don't think will be the nominee. But I don't see any woman in the Republican Party, unfortunately, who's in a position to be a strong candidate in the next election. And if you look at the Senate and House races and the governor's races, there are some women candidates out there, but not a huge quantum increase from what we've seen in past cycles. I've regularly asked to give career advice to journalists and young people generally. I'll tell you, in terms of career, one thing I put above all else, which is learn how to write. If you can write sentences in English that are grammatically correct, spelled correctly, bonus points if they're interesting, that's really important. And you'd be stunned by how few young people are able to do that, unfortunately. So whatever you study, whatever topics interest you, whatever subject matters interest you, learn how to write English sentences and you'll be ahead of of a lot of other people. I started out at ABC News pretty much straight out of college, answering the telephone and doing other menial tasks, and got my big break when I was assigned to cover Bill Clinton in 1991, and I've covered politics most of my career, but not exclusively, and made myself valuable by knowing about the two sides of television. In any job you go into, you want to, this is advice I got when I was in college from one of my professors, you want to add value. You want to, if there's a place you want to work or a business, a field you want to work in, you've got to figure out how to build your human capital to add value. In television, there tends to be a division between people who know about the substance of the story, the editorial side, and people who operate the machines, because television is an extraordinarily production-intense business with graphics and video and satellites. I learned a little bit about both. I focused more on the editorial side, but I knew about the other side, and there's an incredible value to add when you can marry those two up together. Before I leave that one, is there anything I left out that you more specifically want to know? Okay. The energy in politics in America today is with the right. It's with people who think they need to offer nothing more profound than Barack Obama's too liberal and the government's too big. That is, I don't think, more than a quarter of the country who feels that intensely, but people who feel it as their dominant feeling is over 50%. The president has lost control of his public image, and people see him primarily now as a big government liberal on a lot of issues, and someone who's insufficiently focused on helping middle-class people. One of the weaknesses that he has, because he wasn't forced to do this as a candidate, is explaining to people how his programs fit together in a way that has an overarching thematic, an overarching vision of how to help working class people, how to help reduce the unemployment rate, how to create jobs in the future. And into that vacuum, where he's not defined himself, has stepped the Tea Party movement to some extent, and Senator Brown to some extent, and the Republican Party in general, to not offer very many ideas of their own, but to simply be critical of Barack Obama. If the election were held today, I think the Democrats would do horribly. I think they'd lose the House and get close to losing the Senate. They might even lose it. That could be the best thing that could happen to Barack Obama, because I think the biggest mistake he's made as president is he's turned over too much of his agenda to the liberals in Congress of his own party. He's not been able to come up with the kind of bipartisan solutions that he said he would find as a candidate if he got elected. And if Republicans control even just one chamber, I think they'd have an obligation to be part of trying to govern the country, to try to be responsible for looking for compromises and not just refusing to work with the president. That may be the best thing for him. For the rest of this year, though, I don't think he's going to get much less popular. I think he's likely to maybe move up if he passes health care and maybe get some other things done. But I don't think he's ever going to get back, this year at least, to the popularity he had when he first got elected. And that's unfortunate for him, because that's a lot of the ways presidents get things done in their first year, to leverage that popularity. He's in a tricky position now, because we were just in California, and it's episodic and anecdotal, but I think it has a relevance to the problem he's in. You see it elsewhere. I talked to a lot of liberals who are as mad at him as any conservatives I've talked to, who think he's been too conservative on a lot of issues. He's been too much like George Bush. And when you're in the center and you're criticized by both the left and the right, politicians try to spin that as, oh, I must be doing something right if I've angered both sides. But the fact is, while that may be true, it also means you don't have a base of support. It's hard in the polarized country in which we live. If the two extremes are mad at you and don't think you've done a good job, they're not going to work hard for you. And on the right, they may work hard to defeat you. And that doesn't leave you a big base of support. It doesn't leave you a fervent group of people who want to help you achieve your agenda. So I think he's got to solve his problem by finding a way to explain his agenda better. I don't think the Tea Party movement is very formidable. I think they're a bit of a paper tiger. The press tends to take a rally of 300 people or a movement of even several thousand or even several million and say this is the dominant force. It'll never be a majority. This is too big a country for that. Their views are too vague and in some ways too extreme. But right now, as I said, they are more energized, more visible, more active than any part of the coalition that got Barack Obama elected. And he's running out of time before the midterms to turn that around. The most admirable thing about him, I believe, as a president, is he's when he says the following, he means it. He's much more concerned with achieving things as president to make lives of people in America better than he is in getting reelected or in helping Democrats get elected. That may be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because a lot of Democrats may lose their seats in voting for health care or other parts of his agenda. But I do believe that he would rather, as he said in an interview a few weeks ago, be a successful one-term president than an unsuccessful two-term president. You know, Hillary Clinton, or at least the version of Hillary Clinton who was running against him, and John McCain would say he backs down because he overpromised and because he's too inexperienced to get things done. You know, except for running his presidential campaign, it's never been an executive. And I think there's a tension, because on the one hand, he's a very thoughtful and professorial guy, and he wants to resolve policy disputes in the way he thinks is best, regardless of politics. He does want to work in a bipartisan way. He does believe the rhetoric he engaged in as a candidate that said the only way to solve the challenges the country faces is to do it in a bipartisan way. On the other hand, he has let Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and other liberals in Congress call a lot of the shots, and he's got cross-cutting pressure there. And he's a little bit annoyed at Republicans because he feels they haven't been willing to compromise. That means on a lot of issues like Guantanamo and other things where he's appeared indecisive, I think he believes it's better to be thoughtful than to act rashly. He believes that, and his chief of staff believes that fighting for something that you can't win is a waste of time. And so he couldn't close Guantanamo if he wanted to, because Congress is resisting it. He couldn't get a public option because there aren't the votes there on health care, something liberals feel really strongly about. So I think if you take each individual time when one could legitimately say he seems to have waffled or backed down, you could explain each individual one. The problem is, and your question suggests it, is that overall it's leading to an impression that he can be rolled, that he can be pushed off of his position if you apply the right pressure. And that's a very dangerous position to be. Ideally, if you're president, people like you and they're afraid of you. People still like him, but there are very few people in Congress and amongst Washington lobbyists and journalists who are afraid of him. And it's very difficult to get things done as president. Presidents don't have as much power in most cases as they think when they run for the job, and as they're popularly thought. And if you don't have as one of the weapons at your disposal, people are a little bit afraid of you. People think you'll do what you want to do regardless of pressure. That's a big problem, and it's something that I think he needs to turn around. It's hard because he's a pretty agreeable guy, and his demeanor is pretty friendly. And it's hard then. At one point during the campaign, when Hillary Clinton was coming after him very hard, I asked him about how he was going to deal with that, and he said, I'm skinny, but I'm tough. He's still very skinny, but I'm not sure he's still seen as, or he is seen as tough, and I think that's a real problem. Well, we write in the book about Michelle Obama, who was very reluctant to have her husband run for president, but when they reached a deal about what he would need to do to satisfy her concerns, he made a range of promises of things he would definitely do, including quitting smoking. He didn't live up to that one, but he did a lot of the other ones. Once that happened, she was on board fully and was incredibly supportive. And in the campaign, on a few occasions when she said things that were made issue of, like most famously and prominently when she said for the first time in her adult life she was proud of the country, she became something of a liability in some quarters, and she felt horrible about it. She really didn't want to be part of hurting her husband's campaign. And it wasn't until the convention in Denver in the summer, when she gave a very good speech that was very well received, that she turned around her image. The role she's playing now is pretty similar to the role Laura Bush played. Laura Bush was not involved the way Hillary Clinton was in policy formation alongside the president's advisors, but she picked her spots and gave private advice to the president, and probably most significantly was more popular than her husband, just as now Michelle Obama is more popular. She's done a very good job of balancing raising her daughters, which is really her first job as far as she's concerned, and engaging in, as Laura Bush did, issues of importance to her, particularly childhood obesity. She's working very hard on. They've gotten her somewhat involved in healthcare at a few moments, the way Laura Bush on occasion would get involved in dealing with helping to sell a policy to the public, but not very much. They don't want to risk making her part of an initiative if the initiative is not going to work out, because they know how important her popularity is, and frankly she doesn't want to be part of becoming more unpopular, because She likes being popular for positive reasons. She doesn't want her daughters to have two parents who are caught up in the back and forth of every day. I think there's still room, both because the term is just 1 year old and because we'll have to see what twists and turns come up, but I think there's still room to see her role change in some way. I think she's done an extraordinarily good job of dealing with the fashion issues and the kind of celebrity issues and focus on her, and of following the model that Clintons used of protecting their daughters from very much public scrutiny, which is very much the way they want it. In terms of the president, and really the first couple, you know, we live in an age where the media and much of the public is obsessed with celebrity culture, and the Obamas are, you know, a dream for People magazine and Oprah Winfrey and parts of our media that aren't strict news but are more oriented towards celebrity, and they cater to that somewhat, but they're also aware that you can overdo that, and you can make too much of the historic first of being the first African American president, or of being really cute, or of doing things that are outside the job, like going to basketball games or going to the theater. The president was pretty angry when he got heat for taking his wife on a date at taxpayer expense to New York, and I think since then, they've pulled back some of the visibility. The Clintons had the same issue. During the campaign, again, the Obama people, some of whom were familiar with the Clinton experience, really went a long way towards keeping him away from celebrities. You rarely saw him at Hollywood fundraisers, and when he did deal with celebrities, it was usually well into the evening, when he was less likely to get a lot of news coverage. They're aware that that his strength as commander-in-chief, his image as a serious person, can be undermined if he goes too far with that. In Asia, you'll see parties on the left wing, parties on the right wing, centrist parties, parties like a Green Party associated with a particular issue. We just don't have that in this country. There's a few Greens who get elected, but other than that, there are very few. There's some independents who get elected governor, but very few to Congress. And that means that the two parties have to be pretty broad. They have to be big tents. If you take the most liberal Republican in Congress and the most conservative Democrat, they're going to be pretty tightly overlapped. And the distance in the parties, within the parties, the most conservative Republican, the most liberal Republican, is still pretty wide, even though, as I'm sure most of you know, all of you know probably, there have been changes over the last 2 years that have made the parties less broad. Republicans now tend to be more conservative, Democrats tend to be more liberal. They're still relatively non-ideological, and in that way they are both strong and weak. They're strong in that they're the only game in town. So if you're someone left of center, you only have one option, to be a Democrat or a very, very moderate Republican. But there's no Green Party with national prominence, or Clean Government Party, or Reform Party for you to be a member of. The weakness is, every year more and more Americans become disenfranchised from parties and become independents or decline to state, whatever it is in the state in which they live. And so both parties are kind of in crisis. Obama, as a candidate, got a lot of people to vote for him who weren't Democrats. They were independents, in some cases Republicans. He took that grassroots movement and made the decision to affiliate it with the Democratic Party. And in doing so, they knew they were taking this risk, but they alienated a lot of people. There are a lot of people who are all for Barack Obama and his agenda, but they're not interested in the Democratic Party. And so he faces a choice, particularly if he does run for election, of does he build up the Obama movement, or does he build up the Democratic Party? When you do that, when you build up the party, because the parties have become more polarized and partisan, you cut yourself off from being able to appeal to 40 to 45% of the country, which is died and will never going to vote for the other party. Everyone in politics now faces that choice. Watch campaign commercials in the midterms and see how often candidates do or don't identify their party in their ad. In a lot of places, they'll never mention that they're a Republican or a Democrat, because they want to appeal to as broad a group as possible. Those brands are so increasingly weak. The skills you need now for journalism as compared to when I entered are different, in the sense that I think it's irrational for anyone to aspire to be a journalist now who doesn't know about video or graphics or how to use the web, or how to do a lot of things like know how to interview, know a broad range of skills to be able to produce, one person producing video, internet, radio, print. At the same time, at the core of being a journalist is writing, no matter what you do, even if you want to be in a medium, excuse me, that's more video oriented or visually oriented, learning how to write, learning how to interview, learning how to find good stories, and believing in the importance of journalism in democracy, not as a job that is fun and interesting and lucrative, although it can be all three of those, but something that's important to hold powerful interests accountable to the public interest, to tell the stories of our time in an interesting way. That orientation and taking the job seriously, being ethical, following the rules of journalism to serve the public and to maintain your individual reputation and the reputation of journalists in general, all of that is still the same. I think the biggest difference is the relentless pressure of the news cycle, the fact that people have to produce content every day in almost any organization, in any medium, is going to have a crossover to a web presence, even if it's primarily a print organization or television. That's a big difference, and the skills that are required are more production-oriented, no matter what you're doing. Even if you consider yourself primarily a reporter, what I talked about before in terms of my own career is true of everybody now. You can't just be focused on the stories. You have to understand how to produce things and publish, particularly on the web. So I think the press has given a raw deal to anyone. I think Hillary Clinton I'd put on that list. I think she's, throughout her time in the national spotlight, she's brought a lot of it on herself, no question. But I think in a lot of ways, she's been treated unfairly. Most fundamentally, there's no question in my mind that she's in public life because she wants to help people, like Barack Obama. She wants to use the power of government to improve the lives of people around the world, and not because she's power hungry. She's ambitious like anyone who runs for president, but I think that's been a distortion about her. I spoke yesterday in San Francisco area to a group of 200 very smart people and asked how many people in the room felt today that Sarah Palin's qualified to be president, or that they were open to learning new things about her, that they were open to the notion that someday they would think she was qualified, and no one raised their hand. That's a big problem. Now, the Bay Area is not Palin country, but it is the case that she needs to teach people new things about her. She needs to show that she's more knowledgeable in terms of policy. She needs to go to places like Iowa and New Hampshire where their voters vote early and demand to see their candidates. She needs probably to talk a little bit less about Levi Johnson and the things in her family that have stirred up controversy. She's not done any of those things. Instead, she's signed a deal with Fox. She signed a couple book deals. She's given a lot of paid speeches. She's not taking the steps I think any candidate would take, or the specific steps that she would need to take to run. I don't think she'd be nominated for a lot of reasons. She doesn't have broad appeal. The party's activists who control, to a large extent, the nominating process tend to be pretty rational. They tend to try to nominate someone who can win the general election. And Sarah Palin has fervent support amongst maybe a quarter of the country, but she's got fervent opposition amongst a higher number than that, including a lot of Republicans. And no one has taken her on. There's not a person in the Republican Party besides a few weeks ago, and some little noticed remarks, Jeb Bush, who has said word one about her deficiencies, or about her policies or lack thereof, or about her veracity on some issues in her book and elsewhere, that if she decides to run, they're not going to hand her the nomination. They'll go after her. And I think when they go after her, she will have a hard time dealing with the challenges that she gets from within the party. So if she tried to run, I think somebody would take her on and pretty quickly take her down.
Do you think she wants to run?
That she wants to run? I think she wants to be rich and famous. And I think if she was handed the presidency, she would take it in part because it would make her even richer someday, but in part because she does believe in some things that she'd like to enact. But I think she's smart enough to realize how difficult it would be to get elected, and the fact that if she ran and lost, it would diminish her influence and power to make money and within the party. I don't think she'll say she's not running. I may be wrong about this, but my instinct is she'll leave open the possibility of running as long as she can, because the more she's seen as a candidate, and this is not just true of her, every 4 years Newt Gingrich talks about maybe he'll run. If you're a possible presidential candidate, your lecture fee doubles, and your ability to get attention increases more than double. And I think she's going to milk that for as long as she can. More broadly, what's the relevance of a lot of old media? My guess is that not too many of you actually ever touch a physical newspaper, and yet they're published at great expense, distributed at great expense. The evening newscasts, you can watch news on cable TV all day and read news all day on the internet. What's the relevance of waiting till 6:30 at night to watch Katie Couric or Brian Williams or Diane Sawyer? There's still some relevance to older people who like some of these things because of tradition or because of the quality. But the reality is there's not a news organization in the country that doesn't have a website. Time has time.com. And so we're trying to maintain our relevance by taking the strengths of our brand, both perceived and actual, and extending them to the web, which is a challenge because you can't produce the same quality content every minute as you do going towards a week. There's a couple things about Time, three things about Time. One is a little bit, I think, one is distinct from the other two. I won't characterize it, that I think still make it relevant. One is the cover of Time magazine is an extraordinarily iconographic piece of real estate. Maybe it shouldn't be anymore, but if you watch it, Tom Hanks is out promoting this HBO series he's doing in the Pacific. Go watch the interviews he does on any show, on The View or The Tonight Show, any show he does. He's on the cover of Time magazine. They all ask him about it. They all say, "Oh wow, you were on the cover of Time magazine." So that piece of real estate cannot be matched on the web. It's kind of like why do so many people watch the Super Bowl or the Academy Awards? That's an event location. Another thing we do is quality writing. Again, younger people, I'm not saying this about you all, but a lot of younger people don't want to read more than what's on Yahoo News. That's the limits of their interest, and they're not really interested in the quality of the writing. They just want the information. But I hope we still live in a country where people want to read quality, thoughtful prose by experienced writers who do deep reporting and think about things in a more serious way, and maybe more than 500 words. That's not the only place you can get that in Time magazine, but weekly, at the end of the week, we switched our publication schedule a few years ago to publish on Fridays as opposed to on Sundays. So for a lot of Americans who are busy during the week, who don't have time to read everything on the internet, get that on Friday or Saturday and spend the weekend catching up about what's been going on, projecting forward to the next week. Hopefully there's a market and a relevance for that. And then finally, photography. We have on our staff and freelancers we work with some of the best photographers in the country. And photos on the web just don't look the same. Dick Parsons, who was the chairman of Time Warner and a longtime business person in New York, says that magazines in general will be relevant as long as we have the 3 Bs. Want to guess what those are? Beach, bathroom, bedroom. When there are devices now where you can read things electronically, including magazines, but those 3 places, most people are more comfortable reading something that's on paper and disposable and not something that requires a battery to be charged. And McCain ran such a disorganized operation that on that Sunday night I described, when they decided they couldn't pick Joe Lieberman and they were looking for other options, they barely looked into her background. When they did briefly interview her over the course of that week, they asked her almost no questions that would allow them to really get at the heart of what she knew or what kind of candidate she would be. That failure to scrutinize her, I've said on several occasions, they're lucky that it didn't turn out worse. She added some things to the ticket. By the end, they felt she was more of a problem to be managed than a real asset. But she could have been a cataclysmic disaster in the debate, in the interviews, out on the stump. And they're lucky it wasn't worse because they really didn't know very much about her. If you read the book, you'll see they barely scrutinized her background. No one went to Alaska to interview anyone there. They didn't have a single conversation with her husband about what he would do in the office and his background. They basically just did a bunch of Google searches and other online searches to figure out what they could in a very short period of time about her. And they left themselves really open to a problem. As we say in the book, there were people who worked with McCain, some of whom were intimately involved in the decision to pick her, where by the end they felt pretty guilty. And they felt that if McCain was somehow going to win the election, that they were going to have to go to him and tell him that they didn't think she could be a modern vice president in the mold of Al Gore or Dick Cheney playing a huge policy role, that she'd have to be a symbolic figure, because the thought for them of her playing a serious role was unfathomable given the limitations they saw in her. Her being a woman was a big part of why she was picked. And again, to go back to the question of why Lieberman would have seemed appealing, that was a very uncynical pick. And McCain thought, rightly, and justifiably, that he would get credit for picking somebody where there was a big political risk and a political downside. Literally, the way Sarah Palin got put on the table that Sunday night was a few weeks before, when they were looking for a backup in case the Lieberman option didn't work. McCain's campaign manager took a list of female Republican office holders, and he sat down with the list in front of YouTube, and he entered their names. It was like a Star Search Vice Presidential edition, and put in Sarah Palin and found an interview she did on Charlie Rose and thought she was really great. She was like a star, and that got her the serious consideration that she received. You know, people play gender and racial politics all the time, but again, if you don't find someone who meets that bar of obviously qualified to be president, you're doing a disservice to the person you pick, to women, to the country, and that's what McCain did. In terms of overcoming problems, you know, every situation is different. The Reverend Wright thing, Obama overcame the way he has solved a lot of problems during his career, which was with a big speech, being very confident that when he has a problem, and the solution is potentially at least to give a big dramatic speech and a compelling speech, that he can do it, and he did in that case. And then when Reverend Wright came back as a problem, he gave the speech after the sort of first appearance of the tapes of Wright's sermons. When Wright then came and was doing contemporaneous interviews and appearances, he had to repudiate it. One of the things we report in the book that was a challenge was when the sermons first came out, and the question was raised, how could you have sat silently and listened to these sermons over 20 years? And Obama took the position, well, I never heard these things, and people were incredulous. Well, the problem for the campaign was that the real answer to why he'd never heard them was that after their daughters were born, the Obamas pretty much stopped going to church. Like a lot of people of their age and background, they were just too busy. But since they had put him forward in the campaign as a man of God, as someone whose faith was so essential to his life, that would have solved one problem but created another one. And so they couldn't use that as their explanation, and so they had to kind of fudge around it. But the speech worked to diffuse it initially, and then his repudiation of Wright, pretty categorical repudiation, I think was effective, and then he ultimately quit the church, and that dealt with it as well. In addition, both Hillary Clinton and John McCain felt that doing anything against Barack Obama that seemed to have a racial tinge to it was both morally wrong and also politically explosive in a way that could backfire on them. So there can be controversies that aren't generated by the political opposition, but they don't usually last as long as ones where the other side is making an issue of it, and neither of them made much of an issue of it. Hillary Clinton a little bit, McCain never did, although Palin tried to inject it at times, but McCain and his people repudiated it. In terms of Sarah Palin, you know, I'm not sure she's to this day dealt with the controversy over her daughter. And in fact, part of the way they did a disservice to her was they weren't prepared to deal with those issues. When someone is nominated, like Joe Biden, who has a lot of controversy, who had some controversies for the press to deal with, who's well known, it's a lot easier. In politics and in other areas of news, new information is more explosive and gets more attention than old information, and someone who's undefined gets quickly defined by bad stuff. And Biden had a lot of positive definition around him, so the bad stuff barely got any coverage. No one knew anything about Palin. One of the first things people learned about her was her daughter, her teenage daughter, was pregnant and not married, and they did not a particularly good job of putting that back. After they announced they were getting married and the facts of it were somewhat out there, the press generally doesn't pursue stories. Barack Obama about the children. Barack Obama came forward and said his campaign shouldn't talk about it. It wasn't a big deal. And so that died out as a live controversy, but I think it lived on in the sense that it continued to define her in ways that people couldn't really get their arms around. A lot of people in the McCain campaign said this is fine. Lots of families have dealt with problems like this. It kind of humanizes her. But I think it contributed to a sense of kind of like Alaska's the Wild West in a way that wasn't accessible to a lot of people, and raised questions that she never put to rest, and helped to define her in a negative way. The New York Times, for all of its decline financially, and for what some see as bias in some areas, I think it's still far and away the best newspaper in the country. The reporters they have around the world, the depth of their coverage, and national, international news and businesses, I think largely unmatched by any other daily newspaper or any other news organization in the country. Fox News is extraordinarily popular by the standards of cable television. 2 million people watch Bill O'Reilly's show. That it is often the most popular show on cable of any sort, not just news. But that's not a lot of people if you think about the size of the country. It goes back to what I said about the Tea Party movement. There is a core group of people, many of them are older, who like Fox News because they consider CBS, NBC, and ABC to be, like Pravda, communist and left-wing, and they are alienated from it. And liberals who dispute, or anyone who disputes that the media, the old media, is liberally biased, are free to do that, but you should know that for almost half the country, for several generations, conservatives have felt that the media is liberally biased and that it plays a huge role in the outcome of elections. So in Fox News, they have a place to go where they feel that fair and balanced is not just a slogan but the truth, and that it's a counterweight to watching anything else where they think Republicans are going to be and conservatives are going to be treated unfairly. That having been said, it's still 2 million people. That's their top-rated shows, 2 million people. Many more people watch the 3 evening newscasts on the broadcast networks. And so Fox makes money. It creates a lot of buzz. It's extraordinarily influential, despite Jon Stewart's efforts to take them down. It's extraordinarily influential in the old media. If something happens on Fox, the town meetings on healthcare that happened over the summer that played a huge role in creating the impression and reflecting the reality that a lot of Americans were showing up at these town meetings saying the healthcare plan that the Democrats were pushing was a bad idea. That got spotlighted on Fox, and then that spreads to the old media in a way that is more influential than their 2 million or fewer viewers, but it's still influential directly with a pretty small number of people, despite people in my business, the print side's obsession with how successful they are. They're successful by the standards of cable. 2 million Americans is not a lot of people in the scheme of things. I've met a lot of interesting people. Bill Clinton's pretty darn interesting, I have to say, as both a person to engage with and also as kind of a political and cultural phenomenon. Barack Obama and George Bush are pretty interesting. I mean, I thought all 3 of those guys were interesting before they were elected. I think the fact that they're interesting played a pretty big role in their getting elected. But they're all really interesting. You take George Bush, who's son of a president, and an incredibly privileged position, and only able to become governor of Texas, and then a presidential candidate because he was son of a president, but had a certain distance from his father. He loved him, but had a distance from him and a political profile that was different. I found watching that play out from the time he entered the race through the White House incredibly compelling. In the course of my career, I covered the '88 campaign a little bit, but '92 was an incredibly interesting campaign with Ross Perot and Bill Clinton in a 3-way race. The '96 campaign, Clinton versus Dole, was not all that interesting. 2000 wasn't all that interesting till the Florida recount. Then it was pretty darn interesting, but before that it wasn't. 2004 was John Kerry, George Bush, not that interesting. And in 2008, incredibly interesting. But that means that basically I've covered 2 that have been really good, like mind-blowingly good, where the whole country and the whole world's captivated. I'd like one more, at least, before I'd retire. I always tell young people who come and say they want to cover presidential campaigns that you should get in whatever place you need to cover the next one. Because if you miss the next one, and the one after that is bad, you could wait almost a decade before you cover one that's really, really good, and that's too long to wait. So I guess I do hope if I continue to cover politics, which I think I probably will in the short term, I hope I get another good one out. What I've said in the past is to top Obama, Clinton, McCain, Palin, and everything in 2008, we're going to need like a Martian invasion on the eve of the election, something that is out of this world, exciting to make it as compelling as that was. But hope springs eternal. Not that I'm rooting for the Martians to win. I want them to invade, but then I want the president to repel them.